I'm really delighted to be chairing this session for today. I'm a trustee with the Cooperative AI Foundation and very excited to hear this talk. Just a couple of things to get us started. This is our regular seminar series in which we're looking for visions from people about research for cooperative AI as we set the agenda and the granting process for SAFE. We settled on this method of identifying research agendas. And so there's a lot of content in the talk, but we want to sort of stay focused on the idea that the seminars are explicitly agenda setting, describing a line of work that researchers could pursue and that SAFE could support. So that's what we're looking for in these talks. And you're welcome to submit a proposal for future talks in the series or suggest them to your colleagues. You can apply online. I assume all this information is, these links are on our website, Lewis. So the process to apply is online. The proposals are evaluated on a rolling basis. So just apply whenever you're ready, and we'll try to get back to you within 1 month. Because we're looking for people to really think about that agenda and think about SAFE and the goals of cooperative AI, we're also offering a $5,000 honorarium for people who are selected to give a talk in this series. Announcements of seminars are via the mailing list, so do be sure to sign up and share that with your colleagues. We also have opened a call for proposals for work to improve the ability to evaluate cooperation relevant features of AI systems. So you can submit this via our website. You can learn more about it on the website. We're thinking about work that would include theoretical contributions on how to define and measure key cooperative AI concepts, and practical contributions such as benchmark environments and data sets. And I was just on a great panel with Stuart Russell and Jack Clark at a conference at Stanford on Tuesday, and lots of discussion about benchmarks. I mentioned sort of, the need to start developing cooperative benchmarks with thinking about the SAFE agenda and the SAFE plan like this. So a really key area, I think, that lots are getting interested in. As I say, we're looking for applications from disciplines, obviously from computer science, but we're really seeking out contributions from people outside of computer science as well. So please don't feel restricted, and do feel free to reach out for advice and guidance on what it is we are looking for. So now we can turn to our talk, where our speaker today is Ed Hughes with DeepMind, speaking on cultural evolution as a cooperative AI generating algorithm. We'll hear from Ed and then have some brief comments before we launch into audience discussion from Sarah Mathew, who's an associate professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. She's president of the Cultural Evolution Society, a great group to join, by the way. I have learned so much from attending those meetings. And her research is focused on the evolution of human ultra-sociality and the role of culture in enabling it. And I'm very hopeful that we are co-authors soon. We have some plans. And our second commentator is Christian Schroeder de Witt. He's a postdoctoral research assistant with Jacob Forster at the University of Oxford, who researches deep multi-agent reinforcement learning and human AI interaction. And with that, I will turn it over to Ed.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Let me just get my slides on the screen. Let me just start with a couple of thanks. My own say thank you to Jesse and Lewis for organising and for inviting me to speak. To Gillian for chairing, and especially Sarah and Christian for joining as discussants. I'm really looking forward to the discussion later on. I'm here to talk to you about cultural evolution as a cooperative AI generating algorithm. And in case it's a Friday afternoon, so in case you do snooze off at some point, I thought I'd put the TLDR right at the start. So I've got 3 main points. Firstly, very soon we'll have the ability to build machine learning systems capable of rapid cumulative cultural evolution. Secondly, if we do this right, it might provide a tractable generating algorithm for general purpose cooperative AI. And third, there's therefore a huge opportunity for groundbreaking research at the intersection of AI and cultural evolutionary psychology. And that's something that I think SAFE should be focusing on. So those are my bold claims, and I hope to have convinced you of them in the next 40 minutes or so. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to explain what my title means. This means that if you are an expert coming from cultural evolution, or if you're an expert coming from AI, I might tell you things you already know. Hopefully not all of you are experts in both. So just pick the bit that applies to you. Okay, so let me start by recapping what we mean by evolution. And I like this statement from this wonderful book by Susan Blackmore, great book if you're just getting into cultural evolution. And she says, evolution by natural selection is very, very simple and not at all obvious. So how does it work? Well, the point is that if you have variation, selection, and transmission, then evolution by natural selection is inevitable. This is what's really elegant about the thought process that Darwin went through 150 years ago. By variation, we mean not all creatures have identical traits. By selection, we mean that creatures with different traits reproduce to different extents. And by transmission, we mean that offspring inherit traits from their parents. Now, of course, when I put it like that, the first thing we all think of is biological evolution by natural selection. But I think it was Dan Dennett who first described evolution by natural selection as a substrate neutral algorithm. And what this means is that given any replicator that makes imperfect copies of itself, only some of which survive, evolution is inevitable. That's been known for a very long time, but I like this framing that Dan Dennett gives, that you can really apply it to any substrate you like. And cultural evolution then is going to be evolution applied to the substrate of culture. So let's look at this through the lens of replicators. In genetic evolution, the replicator, the thing that's making imperfect copies of itself, only some of which survive, that's called a gene. And the process of replication is sexual or asexual reproduction. In cultural evolution, the replicator is called a meme, and the process of replication is imitation. So let me give you an example of some memes. This is an amazing paper by Maltzoff and Moore in 1977, showing that newborn babies, this is a couple of hours after birth, are really extremely adept at imitation. Here's some facial expressions being imitated, quite amusing. The third one's my favorite. So a meme then is whatever is passed on whenever you imitate someone. So that could be a behavior, an instruction, ideas, information. And the reason it was called a meme, this is a word that that was coined by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. And it comes from the Greek word mimeme, which literally means something which is imitated. He shortened it to meme. So if I'm going to convince you that cultural evolution is a thing, I've got to tell you that a meme is a replicator. So there has to be cultural variation, and certainly the memes in a population vary. So here's some examples of dance moves. I haven't included my own dance moves because that's probably not something I want to show off on at a SAFE seminar. Next one is cultural selection. So some memes are attention grabbing and memorable, others are not. So any of you who are around in about 2006, I think, will recognize the crazy frog on the left here. And I apologize, you'll probably have this in your head all afternoon now. And you might not recognize as much Schroeder's second impromptu on the right, which just hasn't caught on quite so much as a meme. And the third thing is that there needs to be cultural transmission. And of course, that is the thing which imitation enables. Imitation rapidly transmits memes between individuals, and these memes are retained in the mind of the recipient. And with any luck, that's exactly what's happening now in this talk. I've got something in my mind, and through this medium, I'm hoping that it ends up at least somewhat in your mind as well. And here's the key point to keep in mind for the rest of the talk. Cultural evolution is exciting because it is far, far faster than genetic evolution. And that is very appealing if you're interested in generating AI systems which become much more generally capable much more quickly. So there's one other wrinkle on cultural evolution that I need to mention, and that's the notion of cumulative cultural evolution. There's a wonderful paper by the two Alexes, Alex Mathew and Alex Thornton in 2018, where they come up with these set of 4 criteria that let you know that cultural evolution is happening. So first of all, there must be some change in behavior due to asocial learning. Then that behavior must be transmitted to others via social learning. That transmitted behavior then must cause an improvement in performance. And then these steps have to be repeated for it to be cumulative. And we see this all the time in human history. So here's 2 divergent examples. You've got Moore's law on the left, the number of transistors on microchips doubling every 2 years. And what you can't see on this picture is all the labels which show you that this didn't happen in the brain of one person. The key thing about this figure is these are loads of different companies, loads of different people who figure out how to put more transistors on the chips. And so that's a process of cumulative cultural evolution. Then going back a few 100,000 years, you can look at Stone Age tools, how the tools developed during the Stone Age, and you can see going up this figure, progressively more complex stone tools of various types. And this is some kind of repeated sequential improvement in stone tools. Okay, so you might be thinking, why am I harking on about cultural evolution? What has cultural evolution ever done for us? Some of you will recognize this scene from the famous Monty Python film Life of Brian, where the character Reg says, all right, apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public orders, irrigation, roads, the freshwater system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? And I deliberately picked this example because absolutely everything he says in this entire list is some kind of product of cultural evolution. So it really is the case that cultural evolution, I believe, has more or less done almost everything to take us beyond the intelligence of our nearest primate relatives. So for humans, cultural evolution has generated the new tools, skills, and technologies over time that have enabled us to thrive in every terrestrial environment, and even beyond Earth, actually, as well. We go in spaceships and we can survive on the moon, at least for small periods of time, and maybe even on Mars. And it has self-domesticated us, and this is a really important point from the perspective of cooperative AI. Cultural evolution actually makes us more cooperative over time, and that itself then makes cultural evolution easier to happen. And these are points that are made very elegantly in this review book by Joe Henrich a few years ago, The Secret of Our Success. Okay, so to summarize then, cultural evolution enables a rapid acquisition and improvement of skills across an ever-expanding space of tasks. And this is a point that we linked, a few of us at DeepMind linked to the search for generally capable AI a few years ago now in the paper that I've referenced here. Okay, so I've explained cultural evolution. What about the notion of cooperative AI? Well, I'm just going to assume, because we're here in this safe seminar, that you all know what cooperative AI is. But what's an AI generating algorithm? Okay, so to explain this, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to invite you to assume that our aim is to generate an artificial general intelligence. And here's one popular definition: that general intelligence measures an agent's ability to achieve goals across a wide range of environments. Don't worry if you can't exactly understand the notation here, I won't explain it in detail. It's not perhaps surprising that this is rather hard to train for directly. You have to have a large range of environments, and you have to decide which ones are more important than others, and you have to figure out how to get an agent to get better across this whole range of environments. So here's another definition that I like. This is from Francois Chollet a couple of years ago. And it says the general intelligence of a system is a measure of its skill acquisition efficiency over a scope of tasks. So you might see some parallels in this definition, but there's a sort of difference in emphasis, a difference in emphasis that's got something to do with skill acquisition efficiency and over a scope of tasks, possibly a scope of tasks that's ever increasing. And hopefully this reminds you of the slide I had a couple of slides ago, where I said cultural evolution enables rapid acquisition of skills across an ever-expanding space of tasks. And so it's not going to surprise you that the point I'm going to make is this is a tractable definition, and cultural evolution might be a way of actually making progress towards this definition. And the rest of the talk is going to be all about how tractable or otherwise this idea might be. So in keeping with the bold statements I made at the start of the talk, I'm going to try and contextualize this in the history of AI. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some kind of picture a little bit like this. So up until sort of at least the invention of connectionism, sort of 1950s, 1960s, the primary view of building artificially intelligent systems was to take some rules, to encode them in some kind of programming language, and then to get the system to follow those rules. And that was even rather popular up into probably the 1980s, 1990s. Since then, there's been this what's known as the deep learning revolution, and now we do a lot more learning things from data. So whereas rules were limited by human ingenuity, in learning systems, we're really limited by the availability of the data. The data's got to come from somewhere, and usually it comes from humans churning out that data either directly or indirectly. But both of these have limitations. So why am I talking about the final frontier? Well, I think we might be at the start of another revolution, which I'm going to call the feedback revolution. In feedback systems, the systems are themselves self-improving. They're using their own limitations to figure out what to do next, and then to use those discoveries to make themselves better. We've got some evidence of the early points in this space, things like the AlphaZero algorithm, which bootstraps itself up, but that's only in one domain, so it's still a kind of relatively limited idea. We've got notions of open-ended learning. There have been various papers on that recently, and autocurricular. And the workhorse that powers this feedback revolution is something called an AI generating algorithm. Jeff Clune wrote a fantastic paper about this a few years back, where he defined an AI generating algorithm as an algorithm that bootstraps itself up from scratch to generate a generally intelligent system. And this is as opposed to manually discovering and assembling algorithmic pieces that might be necessary for AI. And I think it's important to say here, it's a good idea for both of these approaches to coexist. They're complementary approaches, and we should have bets on both of them. It just so happens that where I'm putting my personal time and effort as a bet is into the world of AI generating algorithms. So because I couldn't resist doing a talk about memes and failing to have a meme, I've put a meme in here. So basically the idea of AI generating algorithms is just to automate all the things as much as possible. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk done. I hope I've convinced you that this title makes sense. Cultural evolution could be a cooperative AI generating algorithm, but I haven't really told you how we could go about this. And I'm not going to give you the full answer. That's the entire research program, but I am going to give you a starting point. And the question is, where do we start? And to go back to this slide, there seem to be three obvious choices. Do we start looking at cultural variation? Do we start looking at cultural selection? Or do we start looking at cultural transmission? Now, I claim that cultural transmission is the least obvious mechanism to generate in AI. Cultural variation, well, you can try different AI algorithms. They'll probably give you different behaviors. And in fact, we do see that, right? In a bunch of different environments, a bunch of different algorithms do different things. Cultural selection, well, you could probably handcraft that. If you knew that there was some way of transmitting things, there would probably be ways to insert prestige biases, reputational biases. And indeed, there's been really interesting work on that kind of thing, some of which Gillian's been involved with, for example. So for me, the big question then was, how do you get cultural transmission? How do you get rapid imitation? And then the memes are retained in the mind of the recipient. So I'm going to tell you about some recent work that we did here at DeepMind about this. And this has just come out as a paper on arXiv. We're in the process of submitting to a journal at the moment, so you can see the preprint. And it's with all these wonderful people on the team. And the title is Learning Robust Real-Time Cultural Transmission Without Human Data. Now, unfortunately, having just convinced you of one sentence you didn't understand at the start. Now you've got another sentence that you don't understand. So this part of the talk, I'm just going to try and explain exactly what we mean by this sentence and what we achieved. But to start with, I want to back out and give another argument as to why cultural transmission is useful. So if you're sitting there and you've gone to sleep in the first bit and gone, hey, I don't care about cultural evolution, you might care about cultural transmission for the following reason. Exploration is for me, I say, the key bottleneck really in machine learning. What we would like our systems to be able to do is to take behaviors, riff on them, invent new strategies, maybe eventually invent strategies that we can't come up with ourselves. That's what for me would be really useful in an AI system. So there are various approaches to this that are already out there on the market. One of them is imitation learning. This is quite an elegant approach because it just kind of outsources exploration. It distills a policy from pre-collected human data. So we say, well, look, humans, we're pretty good at this. We're pretty good at that exploration piece, and we've got a lot of the answers. Let's just kind of learn that from humans directly. So this is quite successful, but there are some problems with it. First of all, this distillation tends to be inefficient. Like a lot of kind of direct machine learning algorithms, you just need huge data. And it's expensive to get that. It's also not at all privacy preserving, right? You have to hoover up a bunch of people's data, and we probably don't want to be doing that in general. Also, behavior outside the training distribution can be bad, and there's a bunch of papers that kind of show that if you do imitation learning, you really tend to hit generalization, particularly if you can't foresee some circumstance which is going to arise. And this, by the way, is a key problem in self-driving car technology. What do you do when you are sitting at an intersection and you're in a situation where what the car does heavily influences what pedestrians do? Well, you've probably never seen this situation in your training data because your training data is just humans, and humans don't drive quite like automated vehicles. So now we're in this kind of chicken and egg problem here. So imitation learning, I don't think, can be the full solution. Okay, so what about reinforcement learning? Well, reinforcement learning has the edge on imitation learning because it says, well, look, we can discover new strategies autonomously because we can explore either in the space of actions or the space of sort of higher strategic options. But the problem with this is that, first of all, action-based exploration is kind of at the wrong level of granularity. If I'm just randomly taking actions, if I went through my life randomly taking actions, then, well, everyone would just think I was drunk constantly, which would not be very appealing, and I probably wouldn't make very much progress. Secondly, it's really not obvious how to construct appropriate options in general. So there's lots of progress on this in HRL, but I still think there needs to be another complementary approach. Okay, so the third approach you could think of is neuroevolution. Well, in neuroevolution, you are exploring the space of weights in your neural network, for example. So the agents can discover drastically different strategies. But the problem here is really that exploration is ungrounded in the environment dynamics. If I tweak an arbitrary weight of a neural network, I'm really not necessarily going to get a sensible decision being made. It's a bit like, kind of as an undergrad in your first kind of tutorial or something. That's effectively what's happening. You're sitting there kind of tweaking yours, so they don't yet really relate to any of the literature. And so it takes you some time to get some kind of model that you can tweak in a useful way. Okay, so the suggestion then is that cultural transmission is a complementary solution to these. It automatically explores in the space of behaviors. So I'm hoping that as I'm giving you this talk, you don't end up perfectly understanding me. That's one of the really key things about cultural transmission. You've got to understand me enough that you can then have your own thoughts. You can pick me up on where I'm wrong. You can insert some you thought I don't have in my brain. And that's what's really appealing about the notion of cultural transmission in this space. Okay, so we said we'd be learning robust cultural transmission. So by robust, we mean three things: high fidelity, consistent recall, and generalization to previously unseen tasks. I'm going to talk you through what each of these mean in the context of our research environment. So our research environment is something that we're calling Goal Cycle 3D. This isn't something that we came up with out of nowhere. This is actually based on some prior work by Kamal Deuce and Natasha Jacques, and their work was also based on prior environments that had the similar properties. So in this environment, what we've got is the ability to create physical, procedurally generated, simulated worlds. These worlds have got various hard navigation challenges posed by obstacles and terrain. And they've got embedded games, and the embedded games have an objective to discover and exploit the rewarding order of some goal spheres. So let me just tell you a little bit more about the game, because this point is important. So every time an episode starts, the agent's going to experience many episodes, and every time an episode starts, there's a rewarding order of goal spheres, and that's going to be randomly sampled. And the agent's not going to know what that is. If you get the incorrect order, you're going to get negative reward. If you pass through these points in the right order, you get the correct reward. So it's a bit like some kind of horrendous version of being a traveling salesman, where you've been told that you've got to visit all these places, and there is a correct order in which you can do them, but you haven't been told what it is. So there's two options you have in that situation. One of them is you just start doing stuff. You explore and you figure out, oh, this was the wrong one to go to first, and you go to the next one, and then you kind of figure out what the right order is. Or if there's someone else who knows what the right order is, who's got that privileged information, who's figured it out first, you can follow them and try and remember what they've done. So the reason that we chose this kind of environment, and the reason it's been studied before, is it's really the navigational representative for a very important class of tasks that require a repeated sequence of strategic choices. So things like cooking, for example, have this flavor. Things like wayfinding have this flavor. Even things like problem solving have this flavor, right? But we started in navigation because that's, in a sense, a kind of obvious traditional place to start for reinforcement learning algorithms. So I promised to tell you what robustness was in this context. Well, by high fidelity in this environment, we're really asking the question, can an agent correctly follow a rewarding goal cycle as demonstrated by an expert? Can that be transmitted with high fidelity? Consistent recall, we're asking the question, can an agent remember the demonstrated goal cycle and continue to follow it after the expert's departure? And then generalization to unseen tasks, we want an agent that can follow and remember even when the world, the game, and the expert have never been seen before. So this is what we want from robustness. Okay, so what about real-time cultural transmission? And this is the exciting bit. Real-time cultural transmission, I'm going to try and convince you this is really hard. And I'm going to take another wonderful quote. This is from Cecilia Hayes in 2018. And I'll show you the book it comes from in a moment. But she says the correspondence problem is tricky in two ways. It's difficult to see the problem and difficult to solve it. So I'm going to try and help you see this problem that's the correspondence problem. And it's being illustrated here on the left. You see these two gentlemen wandering along with their hands clasped behind their back. And there's a little boy there behind them, and he has clasped his hands behind his back in the same way. And that is a really amazing thing that he has done there. How is this boy able to produce an action that resembles the men's action from a third-party perspective when he cannot sense the resemblance? So we can see the resemblance, but he can't see what he's doing. He can't feel what they're feeling. So he's done this amazing translation of a sensory observation of someone else's motor action into a motor action himself with a completely different body. And he can't just do this in this context, he can do this in an incredibly wide range of contexts and across several levels of behavioral abstraction. So not just clasping hands, but taking an idea and repeating that to someone else, or taking an instruction and relaying that on. And it's only hard to see this because it's so deeply ingrained in us. This is so much part of what we do all the time that it doesn't feel amazing. But this is, in fact, this kind of extremely high fidelity cross-context imitation is a very particular human skill. So I'm going to show you now how this manifests itself in our agents, and then I'm going to tell you how we got to the agents. So don't be alarmed that you don't understand how we've generated these. That's deliberate. I'll tell you the how in a moment. So to set the stage, you're going to see an agent. That agent is going to be blue. And you're also going to see a human teleoperating an avatar in this simulated world. That's going to be in red. The agent has never seen a human before. It has never seen any human, not just this human, it's never seen any human before. It's never seen this task before. So it's never seen this layout of things. It's never seen the bumpiness. It's never seen where the obstacles are in this arrangement. It's got no idea what the correct rewarding order is. It knows there is one because it's seen lots of experience of these kinds of tasks before, but it doesn't know what the deal is with this one. It's also not running any learning algorithm. So this is purely at test time. Everything you're going to see is in real time from a single stream of experience, and it's mediated by the agent's own memory. Or if any of you recall the TV series 24, events occur in real time. So I'm just going to play you about a 30-second video. I'll play it in silence first, and I'm going to explain what's going on. Okay, so as this video plays, I'm going to explain a little bit about what's going on because it's not necessarily obvious to see straight away. But what you'll notice is that the agent, the blue avatar here, is using the behavioral cues of the red avatar to figure out what the correct order of things is. And then it's going into this correct rewarding order of spheres. And now you'll notice on the second time round, because this order doesn't change within the episode, it occasionally can go ahead, in fact, of the first avatar because it's seen what the right rewarding order is. And so it's now memorized that information. And later on, what you'll see, if we jump a little bit later on here, later on now what you see is as that first avatar drops out, as that human drops out, who knows the right order, the agent is then able to remember and continue doing this task. So it's memorized the right information. And that's the essence of the cultural transmission, following and remembering. Now, there's a bunch of ways that I could be lying here. So it could be the case that this is just accidental, right? It could be the case that I've just showed you something where the agent knew all the way through what the right thing was. And it just so happens that they're walking on the path together, but they're not going to the same place. A little bit like going to the bus stop. Maybe you both happen to be going to the same bus stop, but you've never met this person before, right? Now, what we did was a bunch of different ablations, which I haven't got time to show you, but I can tell you that this agent is not able to solve the task without a human being able to demonstrate things. And what's more, there are actually secretly two correct rewarding orders in this task. You can go around this in a clockwise direction or an anti-clockwise direction. And the agent consistently does the one that the human shows it. So the agent always does the one that the human shows it. And this is a two-option paradigm task that's actually taken out of the cultural evolution literature. Some of you from that community will know this. So we exactly borrowed that to be absolutely sure that this is a transmission of what the human is doing rather than just a lucky accident. Okay. So let me just show you a few graphs just to give you a bit more insight into what's going on here. So our agents have exactly that kind of imperfect recall that I was talking about earlier. Compared to the previous state-of-the-art agent, our agent is able to remember what the expert has shown it for many trials after the expert has dropped out. And you see that the previous state-of-the-art had no remembering capability whatsoever here. It's also got very impressive generalization across worlds. So you see here kind of the endpoints of our world space in terms of complexity of the terrain, bumpiness, the number of obstacles around. And what you see is that it's able to generalize above towards perfect following, towards perfect remembering. So it's doing more than just following, it's doing remembering. And it can do that both within the distribution that it saw in training and outside distribution. And this is the most interesting bit for me. So we trained these agents and they've only ever seen 5 goal tasks. And it turns out that you can characterize these tasks according to their topology, which is given by the number of crossings you have to do, a little bit like a sort of knot, if you like. And we trained the agents on the 5 goal tasks, but they are able to almost perfectly generalize across to 4 goal tasks and pretty well generalize across to 6 goal tasks. In the 6 goal tasks, in the more complicated ones, they aren't able to do the remembering part, and that's not desperately surprising because these 6 goal tasks actually require longer paths. There's more goals, there's longer paths to do. So it's quite likely that the agent's memory is just not big enough to manage the 6 goal tasks. But I think this kind of generalization is pretty impressive when you consider that the kind of traditional RL approaches really struggle with this kind of thing. We looked a little bit into the agent's brain. So just a tidbit here of what we found. We actually found specific neurons in the memory that were coming to encode social and environment information. And remember, these are not things we coded in from scratch. This is entirely learnt. But when we kind of looked at what was going on, we could pick out these activations, which mapped really neatly onto the presence or absence of the expert, or the presence or absence of an agent within a rewarding sphere. Okay, so how did we achieve this? So our hypothesis was based on this book by Cecilia Hayes that robust cultural transmission is a cognitive gadget that can be reinforcement learned purely from individual task reward, given some minimal sufficient inductive biases. And in Cecilia Hayes' language, these are small ordinary biases, not big special mechanisms. To come back to this, this is exactly the same notion, this cognitive gadgets idea, as an AI generating algorithm. So here are the mechanisms that we found necessary, that we found minimal sufficient, I should say, to generate this. Firstly, inside the agent needs to have memory, and it needed to pay particular attention to other avatars. In its social environment, there needed to be a knowledgeable expert, and that expert needed to drop out for parts of the episode. And then across training, we needed to keep the agents in a Goldilocks zone, a kind of zone of proximal development for cultural transmission. And it turns out that actually all of these have analogues in Cecilia Hayes' book. And so we can see a little bit about this Goldilocks zone by looking at the phases of training that our agents went through. So during training, there was some initial phase of exploration, then they learned to follow, then there was a phase of cultural transmission. And then if you don't have this special Goldilocks zone algorithm that we put in, they eventually learn to be independent. They learn to explore in the test episode and to use their discoveries. And what's quite interesting about this is that cultural transmission is now acting as a mechanism to allow agents to move from social learning to adaptation, to experimentation and exploitation behavior. And this adaptive agent capability that you're seeing here on the right, where it tried some stuff out and then figured out the right thing, this doesn't train from scratch. If we train this single agent from scratch, the agents can't figure this out. But If you go through cultural transmission, then the agents have got the right kind of model priors in their brains to be able to learn this. So to go back to the report card on cumulative cultural evolution that I showed you from Alex Mathew and Alex Thornton right at the start, how well have we done? Well, we've done okay, but not perfectly. So we certainly have transmission of the behavior to others, and that transmitted behavior does cause this improvement in performance. You can get to this adaptive agent stage you couldn't get to before. But we're assuming that we've got an expert bot. So we don't have this change in behavior arising during 2A social learning. And also, we don't have this being repeated. This isn't accumulating yet. So those are outstanding problems. And I want to emphasize that the need for this expert bot in training is a huge limitation. This is almost as bad as just collecting a bunch of human data and doing imitation learning. So where we started off this project was that we wanted to be doing generational training tabula rasa. And we think that if you set this up correctly, you might be able to get generations that bootstrap off the capabilities of previous generations. We ended up backing out from this because we had no idea what parameters to set for anything, so we had to start with something simpler. But we think that we're now in a position where we can kind of plug this into a generational training framework, and we'll get an accumulation of culture. Okay, so I want to spend the last 5 minutes just looking at this through the lens of a roadmap for cultural evolution of cooperative AI. I've spent a lot of this time not really talking about cooperation, but I'm going to try and convince you that really cooperation has been hidden everywhere in my talk. So for AGI, really cooperation is necessary. Single agents clearly not enough, because it doesn't create enough pressure for structured social non-stationarity. And I always like to make this very obvious point: the space of all possible policies is exponentially larger than the space of just all possible single agent environments. It's almost irrelevant to look at the space of all possible single agent environments once you start to think about the space of all possible policies. Okay, so you might think competition's enough, but the problem with two-player zero-sum games is that you've got a unique Nash equilibrium, and this is basically cheating. You can just go towards that unique Nash equilibrium, and you can say, "Hey, I'm there, and now I'm unexploitable," and that's a great objective, and that's why we're doing so well in those kind of games, right? Most social interactions require, at the very least, equilibrium selection, and it's likely more desirable to just dynamically play a best response to whatever your partner is doing. And I think what I've been arguing today is that cultural evolution may give us this kind of pathway for cooperation being sufficient to get to general purpose intelligence. And this is because cultural transmission is fundamentally a cooperative endeavor. Those of you who stayed this long are cooperating with me by having stayed. I can't see if anyone's left, so maybe they were competing with me. But those of you who stayed are being cooperative. And as we've seen, cultural evolution is naturally a bootstrap for cooperative AI via self-domestication, and vice versa. Cooperative AI naturally bootstraps cultural evolution. So here's the roadmap. And I'm going to give this roadmap in kind of two axes, an axis of what the agents are doing and an axis of how the agents might be doing it. So we can split what into information, skills, and goals. It'll become obvious what I mean by those in a minute. And we can split the how into imitation, teaching, and coordination. So what we've been talking about at the moment is in the top left corner of that, really following. So this is imitation of some information that's being contained within the agent's brain. But if we were to go towards teaching, you might also ask, well, can an agent be a leader for a human? That's a pretty interesting idea and is quite underexplored at the moment. If you went down in this axis, you might think, okay, well, what if we want imitation of skills or goals? Well, this leads us towards really interesting research about how we could get agents that were capable of tool use or tool making, for a very general definition of the word tool. And then if we were to go across towards the right here, you might say, okay, what about cultural transmission in the coordination space? So this is actually transmission of kinds of institutions that we might want to be using. So herding, which could be any kind of coordination, like coordination of traffic on a road, for example, or trading, which would be coordination of skills over time. So this is a very underexplored, but a very, I think, deep and valuable space. And it's going to be the kinds of space that we really need to invest in as researchers in cooperative AI and as the Cooperative AI Foundation. So the question is, what's missing here? And to come back to this slide about the three ingredients, we've started some research on cultural transmission, but there's not yet so much research on variation and selection. The good news is, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. There's already well-known diversity objectives, some of you will be aware of, to generate variation in the population of AI agents. And selection itself might just arise as a cognitive gadget. If you apply our method and you just put a variety of experts in the world, maybe they learn that some experts are better than others and learn something about prestige embedded in the memory. You could go and look for a prestige neuron even, which would be really fun to do. So just bringing it to a close now, a few final words on safety. So I claim that this is actually a great option in terms of the safety, possible safety of artificial general intelligence. Indeed, we know that cultural evolution is a superintelligence generating process. The Flynn effect tells us that the generations get cleverer in some sense, and it is safe in humans, at least somewhat safe in humans. I claim the first AGIs are unlikely to be individuals, but rather a collection of systems that interact with the cultural evolution of our society. And therefore, it's really important for us, it's imperative even, for us to build a cultural evolution aware cooperative AI. And it may be beneficial from a safety perspective. But I just want to say, before you think this is too hubristic, we're a long way off. And in fact, we discovered, working with some of our safety colleagues at DeepMind, there's a major safety problem with the agents we found. So the agent was equally happy when it was being tested to follow completely the wrong path. And so these X's you see here, it just going into the wrong sphere in the cycle. Not only does it follow the wrong path, but even when the person showing it the path has gone, it goes, yeah, I'll keep following that wrong path. And this is potentially a safety problem that we should fix and we should fix quickly. Okay, so finally, why should we care in SAFE? So this is an underexplored area. Cultural evolutionary psychology and AI generating algorithms examine similar problems, but they're using different vocabularies at the moment. And there's very little literature at the intersection of these fields, not because there can't be, but just because no one's fostered this collaboration. But there's precedent for this. You know, AI and neuroscience weren't super close. You know, they've been closer and further away during the history of the fields. And when they come close, you get this range effect, as described in this wonderful book, where people from outside, the outsider advantage, people from outside are coming in and finding solutions that the insiders couldn't have thought of. It's tractable. You know, we're building on a large body of theoretical and experimental work on both fronts here. But at the same time, there are loads of foundational questions remaining ripe for rapid progress. There was a wonderful scientific meeting. I think some of you were at that at the Royal Society very recently. And I've presented, hopefully, a clear research roadmap for progress in this space. And it's important. You know, we've argued that cooperative AI needs cultural evolution and cultural evolution needs cooperative AI. I think investment into this research is only medium risk because there are so many possible externalities, beneficial externalities. And it's very high payoff because any one of these externalities confers significant practical research value. So the question is, if not us, who? And if not now, when? So I'll leave you just with my bold claims and thank you all very much for listening. Here's my email address if you want to get in touch, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thanks, Ed. If you want to take your slides down, we'll get a view of everyone. Terrific. Oh, so for people who are watching the clock, we are going to go until 1:30 the hour. We'll get some comments first. We'll record everything for those people who need to leave earlier, so you can catch up on the discussion if you're not able to stay. But there's lots to discuss here, and we're looking forward to this. So let me go first to Sarah for some comments on what Ed's proposing here.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Jillian. I guess I'll start by saying the favorite part of your talk for me was your statement that it's okay not to have understood everything you said, and there's still some value that can be provided, because I definitely think I'm there. I haven't understood everything you've said, but I guess I am stepping into the terrain that I know a little bit better. One of the things that occurred to me hearing what you had to say was, if we look at the evolution of cultural evolution across, the natural kingdom, when we see it in humans, it seems like it was such a great solution. It's getting us to be, able to do all these really spectacular things, but we've had cultural evolution emerge in a whole range of different species in which it hasn't basically, resulted in the same kinds of transformative intelligence. And in general, and that's because usually, individuals are copying other individuals, but they don't have enough innovation by individuals, so that you're not getting like the cumulative cultural evolution. So in some sense, it seems like in humans, it's working so well, in part because the human brain itself seems to have a lot of general intelligence, and that individuals are copying, and then they're basically innovating and they're improving, and there's and without that part, it seems like we'd have the same kind of outcomes as a lot of the other species. So I guess I'm wondering whether whether there's any kind of discrepancy here in which you already need a high level of general intelligence to kind of get cultural evolution to create a lot of cumulative adaptations, and what your thoughts are about that.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Why don't we get Ed? Should we get Christian's comments as well, and then you can respond to both? Does that sound good? Okay, Christian, we'll go to you.
Yeah, very happy to. I have a few more comments. I hope that's fine. Ed, first of all, thank you very much for this really interesting talk. And also, I really appreciate the engineering contributions that you guys must have made. Sounds very daunting. Now, my background is not in cultural evolution, disclaimer here, but it is in cooperative multi-agent learning and human-AI interaction. So I thought I would start by making some comments on how I think human-AI interaction intersects with Ed's agenda, and maybe also share a few broader comments on AGI in the end. Now, my background is research originally in solving and in developing learning algorithms that solve cooperative control settings under partial observability and fully decentralized execution. And in many ways, this is sort of a very exaggerated setting that exhibits a lot of the challenges, pathologies of general cooperative settings. Now, one of these challenges is that we often have a lot of distinct Nash equilibria that all correspond to optimal payoffs. And to be very honest, when I started working in this field in 2017, we were very happy if our algorithms would just select one of those Nash equilibria in self-play settings. But as we grew more confident, the community sort of moved towards finding good learning algorithms that can tackle cooperative problems more generally. And I must say at this point that my boss, Professor Jacob Förster, has pioneered a lot of these approaches. So the first sort of question is like, how can we incentivize other learning agents to select Nash equilibria that corresponds to mutually beneficial outcomes? So how can we make other agents cooperate? And this led to approaches like opponent shaping and a lot of work on the infamous iterated prisoner's dilemma. And then the second big question that we started to tackle was how can we coordinate with unseen agents, with independently trained agents? And that led to, amongst other approaches, zero-shot coordination research. Now, the next step for us at the moment is how can we train AI agents that can actually coordinate with humans? And here we have quite different challenges because, for example, in the zero-shot coordination setting, we assume that we can choose our co-players' learning algorithm somehow, which we clearly cannot necessarily with humans. And then in opponent shaping, we at least assume access to the other player's learning algorithm, which we also don't have in humans. So the question is, how can we devise learning algorithms that can coordinate with humans? And obviously the immediate answer would be, is also what you've brought up, is like we try to infer the sum of from data we've collected from humans. And of course, that data is limited and there are generalization issues and so on. But there's an alternative approach, which would be we start arguing from first principles. So we make hypotheses over increasingly more complex ways in which humans could achieve coordination, and then we verify or we discard these hypotheses through experiments with human participants. Now, where I see your research agenda come in is, and how I see simulation of culture evolution in general is like it's a giant unsupervised hypothesis generator. So essentially it can help us come up with new hypotheses how humans might achieve coordination, and then we can sort of start investigating these particular hypotheses in experiments. And I think what you've also said is that it's awesome that you guys can show that culture transmission happens on some levels. Very hard to learn is a hard learning problem, and it's encouraging, you know, your agenda. And having said that, I think it's really important that we can show that also this learning to teach ability arises. And at that point, then this is not going to solve all coordination problems, of course, that can occur in cooperative settings. So, for example, it's not clear how we can break the teacher-student symmetry in situations. You know, it's not necessarily clear who should learn from whom or who should learn whose conventions and so on. So I think there are still problems that might not be immediately addressed by your agenda, but it could nevertheless also yield insights in how humans might resolve these symmetry breaking. But having said this, if we want to go further and we actually want to end up with algorithms that can coordinate with real world humans, then at some points you will get to the point where you have to ground your simulations in the real world somehow. I think I am a little bit skeptical how well you will be able to do this, because we have these immense issues even in calibrating agent-based models, which are way less complex than the sort of training process that you're suggesting. So and there could also be complexity barriers that we hit in terms of computation. So it's really like the question, how good is your unsupervised hypothesis generator, and how efficiently can it guide the search process? And I think, you know, with all exciting research, you know, we might just have to try and find out. So I think it's definitely a great complementary approach towards building algorithms that can coordinate with humans. Okay, so that's my comment on human AI interaction. Now I have two very brief questions and thoughts on regarding your agenda for achieving artificial general intelligence. So first of all, the safety question, of course, you say that human culture evolution is somewhat safe. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm quite skeptical of this. And then like the question is, how can we guardrail your learning process effectively, which I think you haven't really commented on. And then another technical question is, like, a lot of these, this is very technical actually, a lot of the memes that we propagate in culture come in the shape of algorithms, of maths and so on. And do you think program synthesis would have a role to play in terms of forming efficient representations for such memes? So that's a very specific technical questions. Those are all my thoughts. Thank you so much. It was really really great talk.
Great. Thanks, Christian. Ed, some thoughts for you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah and Christian. Sarah, maybe I'll come to your point first. I think, yeah, this is maybe the key question. How much intelligence do we kind of need already to kickstart this process of cumulative cultural evolution, and how much can we kind of gain over time in the process itself? And I suppose I've got three answers. So one answer is the work we've done, I think, gives me more confidence that AI, as it is at the moment, is is capable enough to get this started. So that maybe wouldn't have been the case, kind of 5, 10 years ago, but I think maybe we're at this sort of Rubicon to get stuff started. That doesn't mean that we're not going to reach some point where you kind of grind to a halt a little bit later, but I think it's maybe enough to get this started. The second point, and I'd be really interested, Sarah, as to how you think on this, is I'm somewhat aware, dimly aware, having read Celia Hayes' book, that there are various different perspectives in cultural evolutionary psychology. And at least I've bought into Celia Hayes' perspective that maybe humans have got relatively few adaptations that arose before cultural evolution set in. So actually, cultural evolution is kind of, there's just a couple of things that were different from primates, and that got the ratchet started. And then everything else we've built, like language and selective social learning, and even the more advanced abilities for kind of higher cultural evolution itself, these have been culturally constructed. And if that's the case, I think that's quite hopeful, really, because maybe we don't need much in AI to get this thing started. And thirdly, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but just to point other people to it, there's a wonderful recent paper by Max Derre where he talks about 2 different types of cultural evolution, type 1 and type 2. And type 1 is the type that he characterizes animals having, where there's really you're mining one particular natural phenomenon. So if you're a bird, you're kind of mining different flight paths until you get to this best flight path. And there's a wonderful paper by Dora Biro about this. Type 2 cultural evolution is what humans are really adept at, and that's where you can mine all your way out of one natural phenomenon and then realize there's another natural phenomenon you can use. Maybe you haven't used fire, you've just managed to kind of use stone, but if you heat that stone in the fire, okay, now you're able to make new things out of it that you couldn't do by napping the stone, for example. And that's the kind of that's the hurdle, I think, that we need to get AI to jump over. I'm not sure how easy or hard that is, but I'm optimistic that we at least know that that's the kind of hurdle. And then, Christian, to your points, thank you so much. It's a wonderful summary. And as you know, I speak to Jacob a lot. To your point about grounding this in the real world, I'm going to push back on that and say I think it's conceivable that we can ground it merely by human interaction with the agents, rather than having to go to a robotic perspective absolutely instantly. And that maybe the tuning problems that you talk about are a symptom, in fact, of not randomizing enough. And we've seen this in robotics with domain randomization. Actually, if you just accept you'll never get a good model of the world and you just randomize, that gives you a lot more robustness. In terms of safety, I agree. We're going to need guardrails. And I think there's a lot more people with more safety knowledge than I. A lot of the guardrails people are already examining in the safety world are going to apply here as well. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel hugely. But I do think that cultural transmission gives us because it's so interactive by definition, it gives us a unique angle to figure out sort of potential problems early, which we might not see in a single agent setting. And then in terms of program synthesis, very simple answer, yes, I think that could be very interesting. A lot of the way that we pass on culture is by writing stuff down, by changing things in the environment. And one of the things we started to look at is what happens if we start to give the agent control over parts of the environment? Does that mean we can generate interesting new behaviors and interesting new possibilities for cultural evolution?
All right, thanks, Ed, and thanks, Sarah and Christian. For questions, if you have a question or a comment you want to make, please use the raise hand function, and I will call on people. And while people are figuring out if they have questions, I have a couple. Ed, so I want to push you on what's cooperative about this. Because, and I think this is partly, I mean, Sarah's comment gets to this a little bit. We see cultural transmission in species that we would not really think, don't have this sort of, advanced forms of cooperation that humans have. And so I heard you say, well, it's cooperative because you're learning from others in the group. but it feels like it's just taking as a given that the group is there and it's stable and people are maintaining. It's like, I can't copy if there aren't people around me, but what generated the willingness to be around me in the first place? Like so I'm going to push you on what's cooperative here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can also link it into maybe some of the points that Christian made here. So for me, the key, what's really hard about cooperative AI? The thing that's really hard about cooperative AI that's absent in single agent or in competitive AI is that I need to be aware of what's happening in your brain, and that what's happening in your brain might change, and then what's happening in your policy might change in reaction to me. And not only that, but then I need to be planning for that in my own head. So I've ended up with this slightly weird view, actually, a maybe kind of unusual view, that maybe equilibria are a big red herring when it comes to cooperative AI, and that best responses are kind of what we care about. We care about that you're playing some strategy. I kind of want to be playing a best response, but I've only got a few shots to kind of figure out what that is. And cultural evolution is, at least in humans, seems to be the process which is ratcheting up some of those abilities. So it's ratcheting up our ability for theory of mind, because if you can do, if you are gaining, as soon as you realize that it's useful to gain information from somebody else, and as soon as you realize you can transmit information to someone else, if you've got better theory of mind, you can better gain information and you can better transmit information. And if that's useful to you, then that's going to make you better at whatever tasks you're doing. And so then that's also going to ratchet you up at then wanting to be better at communicating and transmitting and receiving information. So it's kind of ratcheting you up there. But also, as a society, you're being ratcheted up by this kind of self-domestication loop. And there was a slide I didn't really go into in more detail, but at least in humans, it seems as we've got these kind of larger populations, then this ends up kind of putting a pressure, a cultural pressure on some of the key things which enable us to do cooperation, things like better language, the need for better language in order to enforce norms better, for example. And this is something that's kind of being driven by the same ratchet that's powering cultural evolution. So I think that what I would say, and I suppose playing devil's advocate against myself, is that there are a lot of details here that need to be worked out, and we've only really kind of started. So, you know, if this sounds like vague platitudes, then that's probably kind of what it is, because I don't have the maths to fully back this up. But you know, the kind of melting pot of ideas in cultural evolution in an AI generating algorithm seems to be the kind of same melting pot, and they all seem to revolve around the skills required for cooperation.
Great, thanks, Ed. Christian.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to get back to you're saying you think you can shape your algorithm to be able to coordinate with humans just by having humans interact with it during the training. My question would be, how many man hours of human interaction did you require for your current paper? That would be really interesting from how efficient is that?
Good point. Exactly, and I should have said to get humans to interact with it, but only in a very limited way. So actually, I mean, I suppose how many man hours did we need? We kind of had we had some regular-ish checks every couple of months of kind of us playing with the agents and figuring out what was going on. But we weren't collecting huge amounts of data, so it was probably more like the order of tens or maybe tens of hours rather than thousands or tens of thousands, which is kind of imitation learning might use. So my view on how do we get agents that can end up cooperating with humans through this kind of program is that we actually want to be gradually making more adaptive agents that are more human-like. And in fact, I think we can do that with relatively little feedback from humans. I don't mean zero, but relatively little. I also think there's probably quite a few things that are just universal about human adaptivity that we haven't got a handle on yet. And cultural evolution is a very natural way to generate some of those universal things about humans. That's a conjecture that needs proving or falsifying.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Sarah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to come back to the point about how intelligent you need to be to kind of get cultural evolution to get going. But so I think there are debates about this within the field, but I mean, certain kind of things that are known is that, well, first of all, you almost get a tripling in brain size from, chimps to the hominin species that basically gets cultural transmission going. And, in the interim, in that process of tripling of brain size, you get, species that, like the Homo erectus, that, almost have more than a doubling in brain size. And yet what we see there is basically hand axes, like the Acheulean tools, which are really nice, fancy tools. But there's actually, most people think that that's not culturally learned tools, because for like thousands of years, those tools basically stayed the same, hundreds of thousands of years. So you really kind of see evidence for this ratcheting only pretty late in, like, the kind of spectrum of the hominin evolution. And so then the question is, okay, you need the large brain for this, but what was the large brain serving? Was it the innovation and the general kind of intelligence, causal understanding of certain things so that people could innovate, or whether it was a large brain for the purposes of social learning, like being able to have high fidelity social transmission? I think that's so those are kind of almost two questions. Is basically, what do you need for being capable of cultural learning, so copying, and what do you need for basically making that social learning useful in terms of having cumulative increases in, technology and social institutions at a fast enough rate. So, but that said, I just kind of want to come back to the fact that in some ways evolution is constrained by the fact that all individuals need to maximize their fitness. And so if you don't have that constraint, you can actually force agents to continue to learn and innovate when they have social, even when they have social information. So I think part of the reason why in the natural world you get the fizzling of innovations is because individuals are cheaply getting access to novel behaviors by copying, and to maximize their fitness, they're not going to, do much more innovation. So in some ways, I guess a system like this doesn't need to be constrained by some of the constraints of the evolutionary process of fitness maximization, and that might help.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yes, I totally agree with all of what you've said there, actually, Sarah. I do think innovation is really a key bottleneck here, and it's likely very much a problem. We're going to get to the edge of that quickly. If you ask me what do I think is maybe necessary or not necessary, if I had to have a punt, I think some of the things you said, causal reasoning, I think our agents probably aren't good enough at that yet, and we probably need to build that in somehow. Planning, some kind of model-based planning and model construction, I think is likely. Also, some kind of hierarchical modeling. I mentioned hierarchical reinforcement learning, and I do think that would be extremely useful so that we can deploy option skills and have some kind of bank of option skills that we're using. What is not necessary, my hunch is that explicit social models or explicit models of other agents might not be necessary. We might be able to kind of get those out of social interaction, building on those existing kind of pieces. And I think the exciting thing is that we're at a moment now where we can sort of invest simultaneously in developing sort of social environments and developing really powerful general agents that might get this kind of ratchet going faster. but I think you identify, from a different field, but some of the same things that we're seeing in the AI field, which is really exciting.
Okay, thanks. Lewis.
Hi. I have a couple of small questions. So the first is just to understand a bit better how this kind of, I think this is touching on Gillian's question as well, how this kind of works in terms of cooperative capabilities and so on. And from the videos we've seen and so on, it looks as if this is kind of, in some sense, a fully kind of cooperative environment. All the agents are on the same team. And this is what kind of partly enables the kind of cultural transmission and allows kind of agents to kind of build up their skills kind of cooperatively and so on. So first of all, just like want to check that's kind of correct. And then is the idea that kind of we have this kind of train, test, or train, deploy kind of phase where first we train a bunch of agents, they gain a bunch of these kind of cooperative capabilities, and then we maybe deploy them in some real world online and almost invariably mixed sum instead of fully cooperative setting. And kind of how does that work there? How can we kind of encourage our agents to reach more kind of cooperative solutions in these trickier scenarios, which are not fully cooperative, where we're not just worried about kind of coordination or kind of the overall well-being of like a group that is all the same? So that's the first question. And then the second question is a bit smaller, which is just that not my area of expertise at all, but some of the things you mentioned seem to touch on the sorts of problems that people who work on lifelong learning or continual learning try to overcome, which is basically that with a lot of the current architectures and set kind of algorithms that we use today for machine learning, agents can end up learning tasks and then kind of encountering this problem of kind of catastrophic forgetting if we're doing kind of online learning where they continually have to be updating. And so the question is, to what extent does this proposal, insofar as it's based on the same sorts of architectures, kind of run into those same problems? And to what extent does this kind of cultural transmission stuff actually end up maybe even solving some of those problems?
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, fantastic questions. So let me link it back to the 4 different types of cooperative capabilities that we identified in the Cooperative AI paper, which were understanding, communication, commitment, and institutions. You're right in thinking this is a fully cooperative setup. In fact, in a way, it's not. It's even simpler than that. In a way, it's just an independent setup. Your goal is the same as my goal, but there's nothing kind of linking them. It's not like we're in a kitchen cooking and you've got to get me the knife because I can't get to the knife or something. There's no constraint that means that we have to coordinate with each other. But we do have the same goal, so we can sort of learn things from each other. So of the four capabilities, what does that hit? In my head, that hits understanding and communication. And those are the 2 that we kind of depicted in the paper by a kind of assurance game and then a sort of stag hunt type game, a kind of coordination type of game. That's not to say that commitment and institutions are unimportant. I spent a lot of the earlier part of my career working on kind of social dilemma things, so actually starting in the commitment and institutions bit. Maybe I've just been burnt by that a bit and come out to thinking that's kind of too hard at the moment. So I've ended up thinking, if we can make huge progress on these underlying kind of pieces, understanding and communication, that will then kind of bootstrap us up. And I really like your proposal, which would be, kind of start with something in a fully cooperative setting and then maybe relax this. Once you've got some of this bootstrap started, what happens if you start to kind of introduce mixed motives? On the other hand, that's almost certainly kind of the other way up from the way that it happened in human evolution. So maybe we're missing a trick here. Maybe there's some kind of really interesting idea. I know that Gillian, for example, has been working with people at DeepMind on these ideas and things like sort of norms and norm formation. And I think this setting of cultural evolution is very amenable to studying those. You could kind of set up a mixed motive version of this game and see what happens. But I don't have a firm prediction to make there. And just to clarify your question, yes, it is definitely a train and then test kind of setting we've got. On continual learning and lifelong learning, yes, this exactly overlaps with that field. And the folks in that field have mainly focused on agent design. we're looking at this more through the perspective of curriculum design. There's a slide that I didn't have time to show, but it showed how this process of that I was calling the zone of proximal development worked. And what that really does is it keeps agents in a zone where they can constantly learn more about cultural transmission. So it's modifying the experience stream during learning so that you can't saturate, if you like, which is the kind of problem that is associated often with catastrophic forgetting. And what we found is that if we apply this technique called automatic domain randomization, if we apply that, we actually do enable this greater continual learning ability. So it does partially solve that problem, but a little bit like my answer to Sarah's question before, I think related to that, it doesn't fully solve the problem. We probably do still need agents with better causal reasoning, better planning, with kind of larger memories and more context-free memories, which are able to bootstrap even better off this kind of zone of proximal development. So it's a bit of both, I think.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Thanks, Lewis. We have just a few minutes left. So what I'm going to do is just ask Ted and Vanessa for their questions or comments. We'll end the session, and if you folks want to stay on, that's great. I myself need to run at that point, but really appreciated it. Ted?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Edward. Very cool stuff. Thank you for presenting it. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, it seems that beliefs and the theory of mind are very important to this. Do you think the theory, like past work in theory of mind and machine learning, needs to be improved, or do you think in your framework it's not as important, or do you, these agents tend to infer the beliefs on their own? Yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Great question. I do have an opinion on this one. So as I see it, I think past work in theory of mind has been, I'm gonna class it as quite algorithmic, which I mean in a very specific sense. I mean that people have tried to come up with explicit ways of writing down models for the theory of mind or for influencing other agents. So to take the paper that Christian referred to earlier, this is a paper called Lola, where I'm trying to learn to influence some other agent, and I get to see the other agent's learning update, or I get to predict the other agent's learning update, and then I kind of back propagate that through my own learning update, which is a really elegant and beautiful idea and works super well. But I don't think it scales. I think that's the problem with this. My view here is that actually we kind of want eventually theory of mind to be something which is mediated within the agent's own brain, within the agent's own memory. So I'm kind of part of this, I suppose, memory-based meta-learning sort of community in a way, where I think, well, actually, if we get enough variety of experience and we get the right kind of general biases for planning and causal reasoning, then something like theory of mind can end up being mediated within the agent's memory, and therefore can be maybe have kind of subtleties and efficiencies that we can't easily conceive of ourselves in our algorithm design. But on the other hand, maybe I'm just not a very creative algorithm designer myself, so maybe I'm just passing the buck.
All right, last question from Vanessa.
Yes, thank you for the talk, Edward. So my question is about the slide. You had a slide in a presentation which said that cultural evolution is the only way we know, like in the real world, how safe general intelligence was created. But the thing here is that for humans, it's obvious that you need something like cultural evolution because humans have finite lifespans. So they need to somehow, we need to somehow transmit knowledge from generation to generation. Otherwise, we would not be able to accumulate it. Whereas with AI, we don't necessarily have this constraint. We can find some other ways to transmit knowledge, to just have agents that continue to exist forever or whatever. So it's not obvious, I think, that cultural evolution is like a key ingredient of general intelligence rather than just an artifact of necessity because of the biological reality in the case of humans. And so that's regarding the general part. Regarding the safe part, there's also, you know, some room for debate here because cultural evolution has also produced terrible atrocities during human history, as we know. So like the safety is not like, you know, automatically guaranteed or anything, just from the fact we have cultural evolution.
Thank you for that question, Vanessa. Fantastic. One second, Ed, because it's a deep, rich question, and I personally have to drop off right now because I have another commitment I need to get to. So I'm going to hand the chair to Lewis, and he can get response from Ed, and I will listen to it on the recording. Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks, Jane. Great. So yes, Vanessa, fantastic questions. The easy answer is I agree with both of these points, and I partially just put that sentence in there as a somewhat provocative sentence. But let me go into a bit more detail about that first point about the general part. It is very conceivable that we will come up with AI algorithms that last forever. That could be a way that things go. On the other hand, there are two reasons why I still think cultural evolution is relevant as a bet. Not the only bet, but as a plausible bet. One of them is that we want agents to interact with humans. Fundamentally, that, you know, an AI is not desperately helpful if it can't interact with a human. In fact, it may even be actively unhelpful, especially if it's better at interacting with other AIs. That seems like it's definitely not a safe outcome that we want to generate, right? And we know that human culture, as you've said, you know, is advancing via cultural evolution. So an AI should at least be aware of this, if not have some beneficial effects on the way human cultural evolution proceeds. And because we're going to, well, we already exist in a society which is a mixture of humans and agents of various types. And some of the problems, as I believe, that's created is because we've got agents that aren't aware of this cultural evolution. It seems like there is a kind of prerogative here for us to make agents aware of that. And secondly, linking back to the continual learning point, I've got a hunch that actually it's not going to be that easy to make kind of everlasting learning algorithms that you know, learn for longer periods than humans could ever learn. Already, this is a major kind of problem, right? This is an issue that's that we make incremental progress on, and maybe someone's just going to solve it completely one day. We wake up and go, oh yeah, okay, we've just solved this problem. It's not there anymore. But actually, I think that happens relatively rarely in the history of science. I don't see a lot of evidence that we're going to, you know, suddenly get this thing which currently can learn for maybe, you know, a few minutes and you know, kind of hoover up data a few minutes online or a few million data points kind of over the course of training is going to suddenly be able to hoover up the same level of experience as a kind of as humanity has managed to do. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems like there's a qualitative difference between the diversity of the data that humanity kind of hoovers up and the data that, say, GPT-3 hoovers up. I don't know. But yeah, to the safe part, I'm not advocating that cultural evolution is necessarily the be-all and end-all. But it might be a source, the good parts of it might be a useful source of inspiration. And the bad parts of it might be a useful source of inspiration for what we don't want to happen. And that's, I think, already something we've mentioned in the Cooperative AI paper a couple of years ago. Okay.
We don't have any more hands up, and we are running a little bit past half the hour. So I think now is as good a time to close as any. So I'll just say thanks again to Ed for the fantastic talk, and thanks also so much to Sarah and Christian for joining us, and everyone for your questions and discussion. And yeah, we'll be back next week already, actually. So Dorsa Siddig at Stanford is giving a talk, and then actually we have Gillian the week after that, and then some other people following. So please join us for that. And yeah, again, thanks once again for coming.